Some studios chase a new gimmick with every release, others try to offer the same formula over and over again, afraid to innovate. Owlcat Games seems more interested in getting better at the things they already do well, crafting remarkable CRPGs. They spent years building Rogue Trader into one of the best CRPGs of the last decade, and Dark Heresy doesn't start over, it starts from there. I want to be careful with a word like evolution, because it gets thrown around a lot, but after more than a month with Dark Heresy's closed beta, it's still the word that keeps coming back to me. Let's start with what this game is. Dark Heresy is the second CRPG by Owlcat Games set in the Warhammer 40k universe. It entered its closed alpha phase in December last year, and its closed beta on May 21st, 2026. I got access to it just like every other player, by buying one of the supporter packs available on Owlcat's website. While the alpha gave us access to roughly half of Act 1 and lacked character creation, the beta expanded to include more or less the entirety of the act, while also allowing us to create a custom character. I have to stress that this is not the finished product, and is still rough around the edges. It already plays very well in some respects, while a couple of others really need improvement and badly. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Owlcat Games have a reputation for being, let's say, not in the most polished state possible at launch, and they pledge to do better. So I'm happy to say that the technical state of Dark Heresy seems to be, from what we can see so far, pretty good. Even in its incomplete state, the game crashed on me only once, and I haven't encountered any game-breaking bugs. Most of the issues are minor UI quirks, like showing that you can't use an ability on an enemy or a battlefield cell when you actually can, or not allowing me to deploy my warband members during the tactical phase for unknown reasons. Performance-wise, it runs decently, but it can be sluggish at times, especially when a lot of graphical effects are being thrown around during combat. It's also nowhere near as smooth as Rogue Trader is today after multiple patches. To give the biggest positive example I can think of, combat turns never froze while enemies were deciding their next move, which was a problem Rogue Trader occasionally had at launch, and there are a lot of units on the ground in each fight. So, all things considered, the technical state seems promising. We'll have to see how it holds up once the rest of the game is put together. Now, when we start a new game, the very first thing we have to choose is the difficulty. At first glance, it looks very similar to Rogue Trader and the Pathfinder games, with story, normal, daring, and hard difficulties, plus a custom mode where we can tweak every aspect through a series of drop-down menus and sliders. The resemblance is a bit misleading though. At first, it seems to be missing only the highest unfair difficulty, but at the moment, the combat is extremely challenging regardless of which difficulty you choose. I'll talk about it in detail when I get to the combat section. For now, I'll just say it's the reason it took me around 60 hours to play through Act 1 twice. The difficulty is heavily stacked against the player, with a few moments of pure, extreme frustration that I hope will be reworked before launch. I don't pretend to be a pro player, whatever that means, but I've been playing CRPGs for decades. I've become pretty good at recognizing patterns and learning how to use a game's mechanics to my advantage. Even so, I kept banging my head against the wall in a few Dark Heresy's fight, and I was only playing on daring difficulty. The situation forced me to look for cracks in the mechanics and exploit them just to finish the beta. That's not the kind of gameplay a game should reward. The average player shouldn't have to figure out how to break the game just to keep going. Moving on to the next phase, character creation finally makes its appearance. At first glance, it may look pretty similar to Rogue Traders, although it's possibly leaner and less overwhelming. We immediately get to choose our character portrait, with the option to add custom ones in the full release, as usual in Owlcat Games. At the moment, there aren't many portraits to choose from, but again, this is a test version. I expect the pool to be expanded with new additions, along with Rogue Trader's portraits. Next, we choose our character voice, again from a limited selection for now, and we can even preview some of the voice lines, which I find neat. We finally get to the meat of the matter when we choose our class, here called an archetype, just like in Rogue Trader. There are 5 of them: Warrior, Officer, Operative, Soldier, and Mystic. Each archetype corresponds to a different combat role, as the graph on the top right corner tries to illustrate. Each archetype grants starting abilities, show the abilities available at level up, specialization options, talents, and modifications. Abilities represent the active part of your character's gameplay, allowing you to attack enemies, buff allies, and so on. Specializations, on the other hand, are additional thematic progression paths granted by your archetype and origin. To give you an example, the officer can specialize in different aspects of his support role, manipulating allies and enemies' morale. Morale is an important new mechanic that I'll cover in the combat section. Learning to manipulate it in your favor can completely turn the tide of battle. Then we have talents, which we choose as we level up. These are permanent upgrades that usually grant passive bonuses to our characters, and are followed by modifications. Modifications are another new mechanic introduced in Dark Heresy. They're actual mods that you unlock and slot into specific abilities, changing how they behave. For example, you can modify a single target attack to apply additional debuffs to the target. There are a huge number of these mods, but each one only works with specific abilities, so not every mod can be applied everywhere. Thankfully, the game clearly tells you which abilities a particular modification is compatible with. Now, if you've played Rogue Trader, you'll immediately recognize these archetypes, even down to many of their ability names and icons. But don't be fooled, the similarities are only superficial. This is a completely new game with different mechanics, not simply a new story built on the same systems. Owlcat has heavily reworked many of its core mechanics, enough to make you rethink almost everything. The second major change you'll notice is that they finally introduced the proper archetype dedicated to Psykers. Being a Psyker is no longer just an origin, it's now its own class. If we choose the Mystic archetype, we immediately have to select one of three psychic specializations: Pyromancy, Sanctic Powers, or Telekinesis. In this case, the only origin available later is Sanctioned Psyker, which makes perfect sense given the setting. On the other hand, you can also choose the Sanctioned Psyker origin after selecting another archetype, like Warrior, if you want a hybrid character instead. This opens up a wide variety of archetype origin combinations to experiment with. It's also worth noting that each psychic specialization grants a different characteristic and skill bonuses, along with its own abilities, talents, and modifications. The origins are similar to Rogue Traders, but they're now more structured and make their planned synergies with each archetype much clearer. At the moment, we can choose between Astra Militarum, Imperial Noble, Sanctioned Psyker, and Criminal. We can see that each origin grants one ability, one or more characteristic bonuses, access to additional modifications, extra specializations that complement those provided by your archetype, and a selection of talents. The intended synergies are fairly obvious, like pairing the Noble origin with the Officer archetype or the Criminal origin with the Operative. But I'm sure there are plenty of strange and powerful combinations waiting to be discovered by players willing to experiment. Origins also have dynasties, granting additional characteristic and skill bonuses. Sanctioned Psykers have one additional twist: they get a second opportunity to choose a psychic specialization. As a result, a full Psyker built as both a Mystic and a Sanctioned Psyker ends up with two psychic specializations, while a hybrid character only gets one, and that's essentially how Psykers worked by default in Rogue Trader. Personally, I like Dark Heresy's approach much more. This way, I can choose to be the full dangerous space mage that wasn't possible before. After those core choices, we select our homeworld from three options: Hive World, Death World, and Forge World. Each one grants additional talents, modifiers, and modifications to further shape our character. I don't remember seeing any homeworld-specific dialogue options during the beta, which is a minor disappointment. I'd love to see them included in the full release because they add another role-playing layer. Then we move on to the characteristic allocation screen. We receive 6+5 increases to distribute among our stats, with a maximum of 2 of them invested into each characteristic. All the bonuses granted by your previous choices are already taken into account. Each characteristic also clearly shows which skills it affects, which is a nice quality of life feature considering how important those decisions are for your final build. Finally, we create our character's appearance. There are already a decent number of options available, and I have to say the character models in Dark Heresy look noticeably more polished than in Rogue Trader. More customization options are being unlocked through Steam wishlist milestones, including new hairstyles and augmented models, so I'm curious to see the full range available at release. Personally, I don't spend a tremendous amount of time customizing my characters, but I know it's important to a lot of RPG players, and I'm glad Owlcat is paying attention to that. At this point, we choose a name and we're good to go. The game immediately throws you into its narrative. I'm going to talk about some elements of the story and its most important characters while trying not to spoil too much of it. As I mentioned before, the beta gives us access to what should be more or less Act 1 of the game, skipping the prologue. It's heavily implied that something terrible happens there, and our character, one of the few survivors of a close encounter with the manifestation of the Tyrant Star, ends up on trial before the very Inquisition they serve. We're an acolyte, pretty low on the Inquisition food chain, and we survive the trial only because Lord Inquisitor Zerb takes us under his wing. His motives remain a mystery, but it's clear he wants to use us to solve a series of mysteries plaguing Scintilla, the sector's capital. The Tyrantine Cabal, which he leads, is an organization within the broader Inquisition dedicated to investigating the Tyrant Star phenomenon. During the story, we're told that the Tyrant Star is a mysterious stellar event unique to the Calixis sector, and that the appearance of this black star is an omen of catastrophe. A lot of secrets surround our organization, and it quickly becomes apparent that the Cabal's high-ranking members have very different ideologies and opinions on how to approach their work. The power struggle within it is very real. The Inquisitors are not afraid to backstab each other. Then we have the Sisters of Battle, who are more than willing to shoot an Inquisitor they believe has drifted too far toward heresy. And their definition of heresy is pretty broad. If you've played Rogue Trader, let me just say that Argenta was one of the kinder ones. These sisters are much more dogmatic and trigger-happy, as they should be. Since I've used the word dogmatic, let's take a look at the game's convictions, which seem to play a major role in its overall design. Dark Heresy currently has 4 convictions instead of Rogue Trader's 3. They may still change, just as they did between Rogue Trader's beta and full release, so I won't go into too much detail. Essentially, one path is centered around being the good Inquisitor, striving for unity and cooperation for the good of the Imperium. I can already imagine that creating plenty of conflicts within the Inquisition. Then there is the strictly dogmatic path, chosen by those who want to eradicate even the slightest trace of heresy. Finally, the more radical philosophy is split into 2 branches. One is for Inquisitors willing to cooperate with Xenos and use their technology to achieve the Inquisition's goals. The other is for those willing to do the same with the forces of the archenemy, attempting to harness them and turn them against the enemies of the Imperium. I think you can already imagine how dark and dangerous this is. Throughout the beta, we meet NPCs and witness situations that show exactly how these people operate, often in gruesome detail. Sister Septima fully embodies the dogmatic path. Inquisitor Millicentilia represents the radical philosophy centered on cooperation with Xenos, and we even get to see the consequences of another Inquisitor's attempts to control the ruinous powers. Then there is Lady Olianthe, who initially comes across as kind and diplomatic, but she's also a master manipulator. I wouldn't go so far as to call her the good one. The Lord Inquisitor himself remains an enigma, never revealing anything from behind his golden mask. I wonder what he might look like and why he's hiding it. Grievous wounds or something more sinister perhaps? He assigns us several investigations, and we can choose the order in which to pursue them, effectively deciding which major area to visit first. The game suggests a path, but we're free to ignore it. That decision has consequences, even leading to significant changes in certain areas depending on whether we arrive sooner or later. If you've played Rogue Trader, you're probably thinking about its first act, where the order in which you visit Urak 5, Raikadi Filia, and Raikad Minoris shapes part of the narrative. Dark Heresy seems to push this idea even further, so I'm really curious to see how much replayability these choices will ultimately create. Our investigations takes us into a district of Sibelius' Lower Hive, where wretched souls struggle to survive in some of the worst conditions the Imperium has to offer. Local gangs control the area, ranging from common criminals to fanatical cults. People live in terrible squalor, surrounded by refuse pouring down from the upper hive and bothered by the planet's extreme tidal waves. They're essentially caught between the hammer and the anvil. On the other hand, in the Lucid Spire, where the highest-ranking nobles weave their own conspiracies, we meet the planetary governor and many of Scintilla's most influential figures, all while trying to solve a shocking massacre that took place in what was believed to be the most secure place of all. I'm painting everything in very broad strokes because I don't want to ruin the experience for you. What I can say is that the atmosphere and the different plotlines, in my opinion, are excellent. They're exactly what I wanted from a Warhammer 40k game centered around being an Inquisition grunt. We receive a badge, get thrown near the bottom of the food chain, and are asked to investigate cases that we don't necessarily need to solve correctly. I remember the game's executive producer saying in an interview I covered that in Dark Heresy we're part of a secret organization willing to use questionable methods because it's humanity's last line of defense against the Imperium's collapse. We're the unsung heroes, or perhaps anti-heroes, making the tough decisions that allow the Imperium to survive for just one more day. And honestly, that's exactly how playing Dark Heresy felt. Mysteries are everywhere, our superiors never tell us the whole truth, the stakes already feel incredibly high, and I'm convinced things are only going to get worse as the full story unfolds. Speaking of the story, instead of having Colony, Crusade or Kingdom Management as secondary core gameplay system, like previous Owlcat games, Dark Heresy introduces an investigation system that feels much more tightly woven into the main narrative. I have a separate video explaining the system in detail, but for now let's just say that we can get an entire section of our journal dedicated to a detective-style evidence board. As we uncover clues by following leads and interviewing people, it automatically records all the information we discover. Our Servoscal Ossuarium analyzes the evidence, while our companions chime in with their opinions whenever something falls within their area of expertise. We can draw connections between the various clues and reach our own conclusions, and the board tells us whenever a deduction is contradicted by newly discovered evidence. It's a pretty neat system, and the interesting twist is that the real objective isn't necessarily to uncover the truth, even though I did my best to do exactly that because I wanted to experience the game's writing. Our primary mission is to investigate the Tyrant Star phenomenon and its influence on people, not necessarily to discover who murdered whom, or why people from the Lower Hive are disappearing. We can even choose, and in one case the game actually asks us, to falsify our report for the good of the Inquisition in order to gain useful allies. After all, the primary mission takes precedence over everything else. Different factions represent the power struggle taking place across the Calixis sector, and through our actions we can increase their relative influence. At the moment though, the system doesn't show its full potential, being limited to a reputation mechanic that unlocks additional equipment at each faction's respective vendor. Very similar to the system in Rogue Trader. I'm curious to see whether it will have a meaningful narrative impact in the full game. And that's where a lot more choices and consequences come into play. I'm really eager to see how those decisions will affect the later acts of the game. As part of our investigations, we explore a wide variety of areas. Owlcat added more verticality, along with environmental interactions that let us reach secluded places, which almost always hide something interesting. The locations we've been able to explore so far are divided into two main regions: the Bastion Serpentis, headquarters of the Cabal, located on Scintilla's moon Lachesis, and the planet itself. Rogue Trader relied on a large number of relatively small areas, probably because we, as Rogue Traders, rule over entire stellar systems, and each one is a little different. Variety took precedence over size. Dark Heresy, on the other hand, brings back the large areas that many players will remember from the Pathfinder games, complemented by a handful of smaller satellite locations that either advance or connect different parts of the narrative. It's an interesting design choice that makes a lot of sense, although it also has us revisiting and backtracking through the same large hubs multiple times. Luckily, new witnesses, clues, and investigations continually give us fresh reasons to return. So far, these areas are exceptionally well crafted, both visually and design-wise. Each one revolves around a central theme, whether large or small, and fully commits to it. A hidden cave where a serial killer stages grotesque art exhibitions using human bodies is there for us to explore by torchlight. The sprawling Underhive, where people live in makeshift shacks, fish enormous mutated beasts, and stab each other in forgotten alleyways. An eerie, otherworldly dimension where some unknown entity constantly tries to manipulate our minds. The Bastion Serpentis itself feels ancient, filled with the forbidden knowledge and forgotten history. Even its doors don't open evenly, pointing out the age of the structure. Each of these places stands in sharp contrast to the others, showing us how the desperate fight for a single meal in one part of the Imperium, while in the Governor's luxurious palace, excess is everywhere, and people still die for entirely different reasons. To me, environmental design is one of the game's greatest strengths. If Owlcat can maintain this level of quality throughout the rest of the adventure, Dark Heresy is shaping up to have some truly outstanding exploration. On the contrary, combat has a lot of potential, but at the moment it's simply not a very enjoyable experience. It introduces several new mechanics compared to Rogue Trader, such as armor, the morale system, and vital damage. I'm not going into every little detail because these systems are still subject to change, but I'll explain the core mechanics and clarify what works and what doesn't. Armor is a brand new mechanic, and it's very similar to the armor system in Divinity Original Sin 2. It's an additional pool that must be depleted before we can damage a unit's actual health. It also protects characters from many of the effects and conditions certain attacks can inflict. Some of those conditions can be removed or healed, while others require us to reach a safe location where we can rest. It's an evolution of Rogue Trader's wounds and trauma system, but it's considerably more dangerous. An enemy can, for example, cripple a character's legs and prevent them from moving for the entire duration of a fight, and being a sitting duck on the battlefield is essentially a death sentence. There are also ways to work around armor. Knives completely ignore it, while weapons such as las, power, and melta weapons deal increased damage to armor, allowing us to strip it away more quickly. Overall, it adds another tactical layer to combat, and I'm fairly neutral about it. I don't think it's a game changer, but I don't find it particularly annoying either. Morale, on the other hand, is a rework of Rogue Trader's momentum mechanic. Every unit on the battlefield now has a morale value, and reaching either +10 or -10 unlocks heroic acts or desperate measures. Enemies whose morale drops to -10 panic, attack their allies, or become staggered and lose their turn. Manipulating morale is incredibly powerful in Dark Heresy, and any specializations built around it becomes extremely valuable. In fact, it's so strong that it's often difficult to justify bringing other types of characters instead. Vital damage comes in the form of cold shots that we can perform with precise ranged or melee attacks. We can target different body parts, each with its own tactical advantages. Shooting a dangerous enemy in the legs can push them back in the initiative order, while targeting their arms can break their concentration. That's important because many enemies now use concentration abilities with powerful effects. They are clearly marked on the battlefield and only activate on the enemy's following turn, giving us a valuable opportunity to interrupt them. And trust me, you'll want to. We can also target the head or eyes for increased damage once enemy's armor has been depleted. It's a fun mechanic, and one that's worth exploiting with snipers. The rest of the combat systems work in a very similar ways to Rogue Traders, with units still using movement points and action points. Veil degradation also returns, but it's much more prominent now because the perils of the warp, the dangerous side effects triggered by psychic powers, are considerably stronger. I've had the psychers outright kill themselves through perils, or accidentally summon demons onto the battlefield. Those demons are a double-edged sword, because they'll attack enemy units as well, meaning you can sometimes turn them to your advantage. I won one absolutely miserable fight simply because Sorrow accidentally summoned a Demonette, followed later by a Bloodredder. Many offensive psychic powers now scale with Veil degradation, making it a much more meaningful, high-risk, high-reward mechanic. To help manage it, Psychers now have abilities such as Push and Feather, giving them a degree of control over Veil degradation. All those things considered, I have to say that combat overall is the part of the game I found the most frustrating and unfair. Every fight throws multiple mechanics at you, and almost all of them seem designed to put the player with their back against the wall from the very beginning. Let's start with the cover system. Forget Rogue Trader's version, which was fun, useful, and something you could actually build your party around. Here, many encounters begin by dropping you in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by enemies from multiple directions and ready to flank you. A common tactic in turn-based games is to reach cover during the opening round, survive the initial enemy assault, then carve out a defensible corner, and funnel incoming enemies through a bottleneck that becomes a death zone. Here, that never works. Cover is often insufficient and feels cardboard-made, immediately destroyed by enemy attacks. It seems the game wants you to rely much more on Psyker defensive abilities, such as Dome from Telekinesis or Shield of the Emperor from Psionic powers, but they simply don't do enough to tip the scales in your favor. Enemies vastly outnumber your warband, and you're constantly losing the battle against the action economy. A sensible amount of these units also tend to have far more armor and wounds than your characters, while even basic enemies deal enough damage to strip your frontline's armor away in 1 or 2 attacks. As a result, warriors are nearly useless because their defenses vanish immediately. I'm not exaggerating. Right now, warriors simply don't deserve a place in the warband. The second archetype that suffers badly is the soldier. Burst Fire has been heavily reworked in Dark Heresy, to the point that it's rarely worth using. Burst weapons deal too little damage, they're unreliable, and they now require you to target a specific enemy instead of selecting an area of effect. If your initial target dies, the remaining shots simply disappear instead of continuing the attack. For now, it's a real disappointment. Another problem is that many encounters keep spawning reinforcements, drowning you in enemies wave after wave. There is usually a secondary objective you can pursue to relieve some of that pressure, but interacting with those mechanics is often suicidal. They expose you far too much to enemy fire, put you in a bad position, or simply don't provide enough of a bonus to justify the risk. Line of sight is also bugged, especially around elevation changes, preventing your abilities from working while enemies continue shooting at you without issue. It wasn't like this at all in the alpha version. In the current beta, it heavily encourages exploiting the morale system and the telekinesis psyker ability Assail to deny enemy turns through staggering and morale breaks. It quickly becomes the only consistently effective strategy. The strongest party composition right now benches warriors and soldiers entirely, replacing them with 2 officers to manipulate morale and end out extra turns. Operatives are now excellent single-target damage dealers, which is a welcome improvement considering how weak they felt in Rogue Trader, and they're exactly the characters you want to fit those extra turns to. Psykers are also extremely strong, becoming your only effective source of area damage, effectively taking their role away from soldiers. Since almost every encounter throws huge groups of enemies at you, having reliable crowd control or area damage becomes almost mandatory, and Psykers are the only archetype that provides both. I kept struggling through these encounters on daring difficulty, assuming I simply needed to get good. Eventually I gave up, and replayed the Valkyrie fight multiple times, lowering the difficulty each try. I ended up on story difficulty. It still kicked my butt. I'm not going to completely dismiss the possibility of a skill issue on my part, but when a fight steamrolls you even on the lowest difficulty, I think it's a pretty strong indication that the balance still needs serious work before release. Ironically, some encounters that are clearly intended to be extremely difficult, such as the Khorne Daemon fight, become surprisingly easy if you completely ignore the encounter mechanics. Instead, you simply chain morale breaks and staggers on the demon while slowly wearing it down with knives that completely bypass armor. But at this point, you're exploiting the system instead of engaging with it, and that's never a good sign. I really hope Owlcat ends up reworking combat before release because it's such a fundamental part of these games, and right now it simply doesn't work. Of course, I mentioned all of these issues in the beta's final feedback survey, and I'm fairly confident I wasn't the only player who did. Moving on, let's talk about companions. Besides their performance in combat, each of them brings their own personality to dialogue and their own expertise to investigations, which makes them both fun and useful to have around.
We should count ourselves lucky. Note the augmetic set into the cranium of this abhuman specimen. Said augmetic substantially facilitates his cognitive processes, which makes him intelligent enough to grasp concepts such as cause and effect. At the very least. Simply put, this Ogryn has the capacity to assent to basic agreements.
Haemar, Saro, Larthir, Rakti and Kog were already present in the alpha, but the beta introduces 4 new companions: Aspis, Toma, Hypatia and Discordance. If you haven't seen my video on the alpha, Epione, Haemar and Saro are part of the original warband the Inquisition assigns to you. Epione is a soldier and your main healer. She's worth bringing along not because of the soldier archetype, which, as I've already said, is currently very weak, but because of her excellent buffing and healing abilities. You can also work around some of her limitations by building her as a morale disruptor with a flamer, since the area damage can lower several enemies' morale at once. On top of that, she's a physician, making her extremely useful during investigations, whenever there are bodies to examine, strange substances to analyze, and so on. Haemar is a Katachan jungle fighter, supposedly built around adaptability with his iconic Katachan knife, grenades, and a heavy stabber. Unfortunately, as said burst fire is currently so weak that it's difficult to justify bringing him along. Saro is a pyromancer, very powerful in combat and clearly a dogmatic character. He genuinely cares about the well-being of other sanctioned psykers, so it's interesting to hear him chime into conversations and share his opinions. I'm really curious to see how he'll fit into the larger story. Larthir is an Eldari courser, essentially a hybrid between a psyker and a warrior. He is useful in combat thanks to his precise melee attacks and his assail ability, which is excellent for staggering enemies. He is also slightly less annoying than Irliet, since he doesn't call you monkey every time he opens his mouth. Instead, he prefers small creature. His Eldari psychic abilities are also very useful during investigations. Rakti is the crude outcast known as the Inedible, a powerful operative built entirely around the Hunter concept, long-range, single-target damage. She's also extremely useful while following leads, often helping interpret tracks, bloodstains, and other clues. Cog is the ogre bonehead, the lovable oaf who's almost guaranteed to become everyone's favorite companion. He's not particularly helpful during investigations, for reasons you can probably imagine, and the fact that he's a warrior places him near the bottom of the usefulness list in the current beta. His accuracy is poor, even in melee, and his intended role as a tank is heavily undermined by how quickly enemies burn through his armor. Now, let's move on to the much-anticipated new companions. Aspis Chorda is a rogue trader whose successor is Incendia Chorda from the previous game. She is currently stranded on Scintilla due to a combination of the Great Reef's warp storms and the Tyrant Star's influence, so she is more than happy to join your investigation simply to relieve her boredom. She's an officer, making her incredibly valuable given the current balance of the game, and her arrogant, sassy personality makes her a lot of fun to have around. Toma is another survivor of the disaster that takes place during the prologue. Once an Inquisition interrogator, he has been demoted to Acolyte after those events. He's assigned to your warband and clearly doesn't like you very much, so I'm curious to see how that relationship develops. He's also another officer, making him one of the strongest companions available right now. Hypatia is a tech priest biologist who doesn't subscribe to the usual Mechanicus belief that the flesh is weak. She has an interesting toxin-based mechanic that unfortunately doesn't shine much at the moment because she's a warrior and suffers from the same problems I mentioned earlier. Her personal storyline also isn't fully implemented yet. One interesting feature is that her mechadendrites allow her to attack in melee and shoot during the same turn. She's also quite valuable whenever investigations require technical expertise. Last but certainly not least, we have Discordance, a melee operative who's already extremely strong. She's a blank, someone who doesn't generate a psychic presence in the warp. That makes her a nightmare for psychers and demons alike, allowing her to nullify psychic powers and even close warp portals around her. She's an underhive scum drafted into the Inquisition because of those unique abilities, and when you combine her armor-piercing knives with her origin and the operative archetype, she becomes an exceptional companion to have around. I'm really curious to see how she'll fit into the overall story, because I already find her one of the most interesting characters in the cast. Before concluding the video, I want to mention that the sounds, as usual in Owlcat Games, are excellent. We can occasionally hear people chanting or speaking in High Gothic around us.
Right enough. You're too clean-looking to be from round here.
Reconnoitering.
No. What's your stepmaster? You'll get dirty. I'll have to wipe up your...
Companions are fully voice-acted.
I would describe my condition as physiologically acceptable, yet profoundly unsatisfactory from a psychological perspective. I anticipate requiring another course of sedatives upon my arrival at the Bastion Serpentis.
For me? I'm not allowed. It's what the sergeant says. But he's not here, so I'll take it.
Now, the great Crowbrack has shown them the trail. The vein will live on to put forth new strands and grow stronger. Wherever the trail may lead, may my blood feed on all who would stand in their way.
Heck, the whole game will be fully voice-acted.
You heard my words. You saved Grektar. I will forget that you trespassed in the roost. The kin band will not tear you apart. For now.
With the only exceptions being the narrator and the silent protagonist. They decided to go down this road because many role players seem to prefer an unvoiced main character, allowing them to better step into their character's shoes. I don't entirely agree with that approach, but it's fine, and it won't ruin my experience. For now, only roughly half of the beta is voiced, mainly the Marisportum section, and the quality is absolutely excellent. Even the ambient dialogue has been recorded.
The Shaper forbade eating fish, but But in the sea there is that which eats fish. The Shaper did not forbid that.
The companions' performances really capture each character's personality and quirks. The only part I found a little annoying is the crew constantly crying and screeching like birds. It's a bit excessive considering how much time you may spend talking to them. The music is also absolutely top-notch, blending perfectly with both the atmosphere and the situations that trigger it.
The veil is tearing!
I mean, no surprises there. Owlcat's soundtracks have consistently been excellent, ever since Kingmaker, but it's still nice to see them keeping that standard. To wrap up my thoughts, I think Dark Heresy shows a lot of promise. It gets really high marks from me for its atmosphere, area design, narrative, visuals, voice acting and soundtrack. My only real concern is class balance and combat, which still need a lot of work before release. I also think this game will appeal not only to Warhammer 40k fans, but to CRPG enthusiasts in general, especially those who enjoy exploring every nook and cranny, exhausting every dialogue option, and patiently listening to characters rather than rushing through the experience. If balance in classes and combat will be achieved, it will also cater to TRPG players who enjoy the strategy and tactical layers these games can provide. I do wonder how big this game will end up being. Starrock from Owlcat mentioned in an interview that the goal is to make Dark Heresy a more compact experience than Rogue Trader, while offering greater replayability. To be honest though, this first act already feels pretty substantial, so I'm curious to see whether the scope of the game will gradually grow beyond Owlcat's original plans. And that's it. I hope you found this video useful, whether you're interested in Dark Heresy or still on the fence about Owlcat's next game. I'll be covering Dark Heresy for a long time to come, so if you're interested in it, Rogue Trader or computer RPGs in general, this channel is dedicated exactly to those games. So I hope you stick around for the videos to come. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.